When we picture the Middle Ages, our minds often fill with knights, kings, and towering cathedrals. But beneath that world of castles and crusades lived another story, quieter, unseen, and far more enduring. It was the story of women. Across the fields, villages, and towns of medieval Europe, women made up half the population, yet their voices rarely reached the parchment of history. Their names are seldom recorded, their thoughts almost never written down. And yet, it was their hands that kneaded the bread, spun the wool, raised the children, and kept the fragile rhythm of life moving forward through the centuries we call the Dark Ages. This is not a story of queens and noble ladies, though they too shaped history. It is the story of ordinary women, peasants, servants, midwives, and nuns, women whose strength and silence carried Europe through its most difficult centuries. A medieval village was small, perhaps only a few dozen houses made of wattle and daub, thatched with straw. In such places, most women were born, lived, and died within a few miles of home. Life was ruled by the seasons and the soil. A girl was expected to work from an early age. Before she could read or write, she learned how to carry water, feed animals, and help her mother with cooking and weaving. Childhood, as we understand it, was brief. By the age of 12 or 13, a girl was already preparing for marriage, or, if she was poor, was sent to work as a servant in another household. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely about romance. For peasants, it was an economic bond, a partnership for survival. A man needed a wife to help work the fields, bake bread, and manage the home. A woman needed a husband to provide land and protection. The church required that marriage be a sacred contract, but in practice, it was often a practical arrangement negotiated between families. For most women, home was both a workplace and a shelter. Inside, life revolved around the hearth, the only source of warmth and cooking. Women spun wool into thread, wove rough cloth, and mended clothes endlessly. They prepared meals from bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown. Meat was a luxury reserved for feasts. Water had to be fetched daily from a communal well or stream, carried in heavy wooden buckets. Laundry was done by hand in cold water, beaten against stones. In summer, women gathered herbs and berries. In winter, they mended and prayed for the next harvest. In the eyes of the church, women were seen as both sacred and suspect. On one hand, the Virgin Mary represented purity, motherhood, and divine grace. On the other, Eve's sin was believed to have brought suffering into the world. This tension shaped how women were viewed, both revered and restricted. Religion was central to every aspect of life. Women attended Mass, confessed their sins, and prayed for mercy, just like men. But they were excluded from the priesthood and most positions of learning. The church taught that a woman's duty was to obey her husband and serve her family faithfully. Still, faith offered comfort. Many women found meaning in devotion through prayer, charity, and ritual. And for some, the convent offered an entirely different path. A convent, or nunnery, was one of the few places in medieval Europe where a woman could read, write, and hold authority. Women who entered religious life became part of communities dedicated to prayer, education, and healing. Some were noble daughters sent by their families. Others joined voluntarily, seeking refuge from marriage or the chaos of the world. Within the convent walls, life was strictly ordered. The day began with prayer before dawn and ended in silence after sunset. Nuns copied manuscripts, taught girls from noble families, tended to the sick, and kept gardens that provided both food and medicine. In an age when most women could not read, nuns became custodians of knowledge. Some wrote poetry and theology, others composed music and illuminated manuscripts. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, show that women's intellect could shine even in a time of constraint. She wrote of nature, medicine, and divine visions. Her work still studied today as proof that the medieval mind was not entirely bound by darkness. Outside convents, most women lived lives of unrecorded labor. Peasant women worked side by side with men during planting and harvest. They rose before dawn, tended the animals, baked bread, and cared for children. On feast days, they joined in dances and songs, brief moments of joy in otherwise harsh lives. The medieval woman's world was not limited to the home. Markets were often filled with female traders selling eggs, butter, cloth, or ale. Brewing was commonly done by women, known as alewives. In towns, widows sometimes ran workshops or inns. Guilds, though male-dominated, occasionally allowed women to take over their husband's trade after his death. But their freedoms were fragile. A widow might enjoy brief independence, but remarriage often surrendered property and control. A young woman working in service risked mistreatment or worse. Laws varied across Europe, but women's rights were almost always secondary to those of men. Education for women was rare. In peasant villages, literacy was almost unheard of. Only in noble households or convents did girls sometimes learn to read or write Latin. Knowledge was considered a male domain, and for most women, learning was confined to the skills of home and field. Despite their limited power, women shaped culture in subtle ways. They passed down stories, songs, and remedies. They taught children, maintained moral order, and kept faith alive during times of war and plague. During the Black Death in the 14th century, women served as caregivers, nurses, and grave diggers when others fled. Many risked their lives to tend to the dying. Their names are not remembered, but their compassion saved countless souls. Art and literature from the period revealed glimpses of these women. Illuminated manuscripts show them baking bread, washing clothes, spinning wool. Marginal drawings, often added playfully by monks, sometimes depict wives scolding lazy husbands or women balancing baskets on their heads. Though drawn as humor, they capture a truth. Women were the engine of daily life. Marriage defined most women's status. Under medieval law, a wife was subject to her husband's authority. She could not own property independently in most regions, nor make contracts without his consent. However, in practice, many wives managed family finances, especially when men were away on military service or trade. In England and France, the concept of femme sole, or single woman, allowed widows and unmarried women in towns to conduct business. This small loophole gave rise to successful female merchants, especially in cloth and brewing trades. Among the rural poor, cooperation was essential. A husband and wife worked as partners to survive. A woman's contribution to agriculture, milking cows, tending gardens, preserving food, was as vital as her husband's plowing.
The medieval household was a unit of shared labor, not leisure. Childhood for girls ended early. By 14, many were married or betrothed. Some marriages were arranged by lords, others by parents seeking stability. The church's blessing made the union legitimate, but affection often grew only after years together, if it grew at all. For unmarried women, life was precarious. They might live with family, serve in noble houses, or join religious orders. Poverty and reputation were constant threats. A woman without a husband or convent was often viewed with suspicion, sometimes even accused of witchcraft or sin. The late Middle Ages brought small but significant changes. The rise of towns and trade gave some women new roles as artisans and shopkeepers. In Italy, textile workshops employed thousands of women. In France, women worked in wine production and silk weaving. In England, they dominated local markets. Still, even in towns, the law kept them in narrow bounds. A woman's identity was tied to her husband or father. And yet, through work and persistence, they carved spaces of autonomy in a man's world. Faith remained their deepest refuge. Every village had its patron saint, and many women found spiritual connection through devotion to female saints like Catherine of Siena or Mary Magdalene. Pilgrimages, though dangerous, offered moments of independence and purpose. A woman walking the roads of Europe with a rosary in hand was a rare sight, but not an impossible one. The written voices that survive from medieval women are few but powerful. Letters, wills, and prayers reveal their thoughts. A 14th-century Englishwoman named Marjorie Kemp dictated her life story, one of the earliest autobiographies in English. She was not a nun or noble, but a merchant's wife and mother of 14. Her visions and confessions reveal both deep faith and the struggles of being a woman in a rigid society. As the centuries passed, change came slowly. The Renaissance, often celebrated as a rebirth of learning, opened few doors for women. Education remained limited, freedom remained conditional. But the foundations of community, trade, and care, built largely by women, endured. The story of the medieval woman is not one of rebellion or fame. It is one of endurance. Through cold winters, hunger, childbirth, and loss, they held their families and villages together. They prayed for good harvests, for healthy children, for peace. While kings waged wars and chroniclers recorded their victories, women tilled the earth, baked the bread, and kept the candles burning. In silence, they sustained a civilization. When we walk through the ruins of a medieval village or stand in a great cathedral, their work still surrounds us. The woven cloth, the baked bricks, the cared-for children who became the next generation. Their names may not be known, but their lives formed the quiet backbone of history. The Middle Ages were not only an age of faith and iron, they were an age of women's resilience. For every stone castle that remains, there were thousands of cottages tended by their hands. For every saint remembered, there were countless mothers, daughters, and widows who carried on unseen. To remember them is to hear the heartbeat of a forgotten world, a rhythm steady and humble, echoing beneath the clang of swords and the chanting of monks. Theirs were the voices in silence, the women who lived, endured, and made the Middle Ages possible.